Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC and is dedicated in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Shalom, and Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom. It is also in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz, Le'erech Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. We're in the middle of chapter 10, Perek Yud of Tanya, talking about the tzaddik, and in general the two categories of a tzaddik. But as we've learned, there are many subcategories. So as usual as it is in Torah, you can talk about categories, but then when you break it breaks down into many, many more levels. However, there's a key distinction between the tzaddik she'eina gomer and the tzaddik gomer, as we shall learn. So let's go over what we learned last week and continue on. So after explaining the contrast between these two levels of tzaddik, and remember we're talking about both are of the highest level, someone who's in totally control, not just of their garments, not just of their thought, speech, and action, but also of their very faculties, where the animal soul does not have any say any longer, even by the tzaddik she'eina gomer. The only thing is, the tzaddik she'eina gomer, it's not been completely transformed. It's like conquer the city, but there's still pockets that are not resistance, but they haven't been transformed. They're not total allies. In Avodah, he said that there isn't the absolute and total and utter despise and repulsion by the negative. Whereas in tzaddik gomer, there's no room for anything. Like we discussed, ein ed milvadeh, nothing but God. So even the tzaddik she'eina gomer is quite a rarity, as we shall learn that Tanya is sefer shel beinim. What's expected is a beinani. Even a tzaddik she'eina gomer is not expected. But in the name of thoroughness and also in the name of what our standards are, the Alter Rebbe is explaining both levels. So in discussing the contrast between them, and there's two different names that each has, tzaddik gomer and tzaddik v'tovlei, completely tov, and gomer means his ava, his love for God is complete and absolute, like the Rebbe Rashab explains, that the ava is gemura. And b'meila, automatically, is the despise of the opposite. The more you love something, the more you dislike its opposite. If you love good, you're going to dislike bad. And here dislike doesn't mean in a negative way. It means that you're completely repulsed by it. Something that is completely off limits. If the av is not gomer, so that's a tzaddik she'eina gomer. So then it's a tzaddik v'raloi, and the ra, meaning that negative, from the negative side, is completely subjugated. But it's raloi, is kof ubotl to him, to the teiv. But it means it's there. Kof ubotl means it's completely subjugated. Like in the conquering of a city, so the enemy has been conquered, but it's still kof ubotl, it's not been eliminated and therefore not been transformed, and therefore not eliminated. Okay. So what is it then? So he called it botl b'mi'utei, v'kala chashiv. That's the words he uses. Botl b'mi'utei, which means that it is nullified in its minimalistic character. So it's effectively absent due to its insignificant presence. So for example, when the Gemara says, the shraga betira mayahana, a flame in the light of the sun, what benefit is there? It doesn't mean there's no flame there. It doesn't mean there's no light, but in the light of the sun, it's completely bottled. As a matter of fact, Chassidus points out that not only doesn't it add light, it actually darkens the light. When you look at a flame in the middle of sunlight, in the middle of a sunny day, not only is it not illuminating, it's darker than this day. But if you close down the sun, once the sun sets, this flame is going to burn. That's a concept of bittul. So this is the concept of being nullified. And that's why the person indeed is called tzaddik v'ra kofufu botloi. The evil is suppressed. Evil here meaning any shemetz, any even smidgen of being drawn to material existence. Okay. And that's why it's also called Tzaddik She'eino Gomer, like you said, because the Av is not complete. Then the Alter Rebbe continues, which we learned last week, but let's go over it again. V'hine. Now, Madrega Zu, this level of the incomplete Tzaddik, Mischalekes L'Revovis Madregas, is subdivided into Revovis is tens of thousands of levels. In Hebrew, Revov is 10,000. Revovis is tens of thousands. And what distinguishes one level from the next? Well, once we've established that it's a matter of a bittul, the question is now what that bittul constitutes. So you could have the good is so dominant and the negative that's still not been transformed is so minimal. Let's go back to the example of a city. Let's say a city of 1,000 people. Now, 950 of those people have not only been conquered, but they've also been transformed. They're now allies of the king, in this case of the divine soul. But there's 50 people who you can't call allies. You can't call them enemies because they're not showing any resistance. They've been subjugated. They've been nullified. So 50 nullified among the 1,000. It could be 10. It could be 5. It could be one person. Just to use a physical example. So that's what would distinguish the different levels, depending on the bittul. The Alter Rebbe breaks that into two parts. One is, you can say, more qualitative, one is more quantitative in a way. He says, what's the bittul constitute? He says, "V'hine madreges u'meschalekes v'lervovas madreges be'inyan b'chines miut hara hanisher." Regarding the minuscule, and he keeps using the word ra, because remember, back in Perek Vav, he explained that ra doesn't mean evil. It means anything that's not kedusha is already considered sitra acher, the other side. Because if it's not completely divine, there's something there. What is there? It may not be against the divine, but it means the divine has not consumed the entire consciousness. So in that sense, the bechinas miut hara hanisher. Be'echad ma'arba ha'yeseides haroim. So the first thing is regarding that what distinguishes one level from the next is how much has been diminished, or you could say nullified, in that which remains from the 4 Yeseides Haroim. Remember, the end of chapter 1, he spoke about that all the negative traits and characteristics come from the four negative elements: anger and arrogance from fire, pleasures and taivas from water, atzvus and aslus, laziness and slothfulness, and depression from earth. Halilus, I'm not saying the exact order. Halilus meaning nonsense, empty talk from wind, air. So now, even though it's been eliminated, but it's not been totally transformed, so the question is, how much remains from that? That's the first element. What level is there? So it could be, let's say, this person is someone that at some point, just hypothetically, had some form of arrogance, even the most subtle form. But he's eliminated it now. But he's not eliminated it completely, meaning it's not been transformed completely to Kedusha. So that's one thing that would determine what level tzaddik is among the tens of thousands of levels. A second way of determining it is how much has been nullified. So one is which of these negative characteristics we're talking about. And the second is be'inyan bitule b'miyute. How much has been voided by dilution? And here the Alter Rebbe gives examples. B'shishim al derech moshel. For example, such as a dilution by 60, 1 in 60, oy be'elef, or in 1,000, or 1 in 1,000, urevova, or 10,000. So it's very different if it's 1 in 60 and 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. So here he's not talking about which one is it. Is it fire, water, wind, or air, and earth? Now he's talking about in one of them, how bottle is it? How much it has really been completely eliminated and how much still remains not transformed. Now, we know in halacha, these are examples that are used. In halacha, you have the concept of when a non-kosher food or substance is mixed with a kosher one, so then it would usually make it not kosher. However, if the non-kosher part is only 1/60th, in some cases, like the Gemara says in Chulin, Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis, if it's 1 in 60, it's not considered. That doesn't mean it's not there, but like we said with the light and the flame, the candle in the light of the sun, it's completely nullified. In some cases, we find 1 in 1,000, which obviously means that that non-kosher item needs a lot more good to nullify it. And that we find the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos, Trumis 10.8, Perek Yud Mishnah Ches. And then we find sometimes 1 in 10,000. The Rebbe brings this in his notes, and he brings from the Mishnah in Zvachim, Ches Aleph, Perek Ches, Mishnah Aleph. And then there are more details exactly what it says in halacha about it, but the point being is that you have these 3 examples he gives. And then he says, Ukiyetze al derech moshel. And similar, for example, the Rebbe asks the question, what's the kiyetze? And the Rebbe answers on the word kiyetze that it means, perhaps, that it means that he's talking now in quality, not just quantity. Because when you talk about 1 in 60, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, that sounds like a quantity thing. But then the concept of chiyetza could mean, he says, in quality. The Rebbe leaves it in that Tzaddikim. We still need to understand al derech Chassidus. What does it mean in Chassidus? The difference between the quantity and the quality in this context. Also, if you think about it, the first point he made was regarding what type of negative of the 4 Yuseidus, of the 4 elements. But there, you can say not necessarily purely quality, there's just what type. Then we talk about the amount that's left, the amount that's not left. For example, when you say by a tzaddik, he should have some kavod atzmi, shmini shebeshminis. He shouldn't be completely nullified. There should be shmini shebeshminis of certain sense of self. So that's an element of a dimension. But it's obviously so small and so minuscule. Just using that as an example. It's not chaz v'shalom, a form of gaiva. Just showing the idea of numbers and things that are in contrast to each other. But now we talk about quality. So the Rebbe says we need an explanation. What would that mean? Okay, but the point that we really get down to is this. That now we have a formula. I wish an algorithm, if you like, to discuss what level of a tzaddik she'eina gomer it is. Because there's so many different variations. As I said with the city, it could be 50 that have not been transformed. It could be 40. It could be 1. The same thing in context of people's serving the divine. It could be what midah has not been completely transformed. It could be the amount is nullified in different levels of the amount, and also in quality. However one explains that. And that would determine what level of a tzaddik she'eina gomer it is. Now, of course, we're not given the right to go and judge and decide who's on what level, but now we have something to look at. You know, we have the concept, for example, in Masechta Yuma, it talks about the difference between tshuva miyira and tshuva ma'ava. That when you do tshuva miyira out of reverence, You make zdeinas nasle kishgogis. You can take a deliberate sin and it becomes considered as if it's an undeliberate one. Tshuva ma'ava, the highest level, from love, transforms zdeinas nasle kizachis. That deliberate sins become actually like merits, completely transformed. You could also have a situation where you erase this zdeinas. Mekana lahaba, from here further, you've erased it, but you haven't transformed the past. And you could also have a tshuva that transforms the mafreya, also the past. What do you see from this? The same idea. There's a tshuva that does not transform. That doesn't mean tshuva wasn't done. There's no longer zdeinas. But they still not been completely transformed into merits. So there's something still that remains. It's just a dugma, an example of a tzaddik shein negomer. And there are many levels in that. Then there's a tshuva ma'ava, that's zdeinas nasle kezochis. We learned it earlier in chapter 7, where there's no more room for anything because it's been transformed. Not only are there no more zdeinas, they've become merits. And once they become merits, everything has been you've covered all the bases. So there's no room for any, nothing's even batel b'shishim or in 1,000 or in 10,000. So here we're talking about the tzaddik shein negomer, and that's what distinguishes the levels. And with that, he then brings, and where do we see levels? The hein b'chinas tzaddikim harabim shebechol haderes. What he said before, him madreges u'mischalekes l'revovis madreges, l'revovis madreges rather, that this level of the tzaddik that's not complete subdivides into tens of thousands of levels. And it's interesting when you look at the word revovis, madreges, and then he uses revava in the batel b'shishim and then he says be'elef revava. It's hard to ignore. Is there something here about that? I haven't seen in any of the commentaries on Tanya being pointed out, but perhaps that's why he says tens of thousands of levels, because when you're talking about the bittul in 10,000. Right there you have 10,000 levels, 10,000 possibilities. 1 in 10,000, or it could be less, 2 in 10,000, etc. So just pointing that out. But now he goes back. So these tens of thousands of levels, the hein, which are determined by what we just described, the type of negative personality of the 4 negative elements, and its measure, how much it's nullified. Hein, that determines the many different tzaddikim. Hein, b'chinas tzaddikim harabim shebechol haderes. And these levels account for the many tzaddikim found throughout the generations. We know there were tzaddikim throughout the generations. There are many of them, and they're not necessarily on the same level. How do you explain them? So now he's given us a formula how to explain the different tzaddikim. And then brings a proof from Gemara that where do you see different tzaddikim? The Gemara in Sukkah, Mem Hey Amid Beis, in Sukkah 45b, he says, the tamneser, alfei tzaddikei, koimi kamek HaKadosh Baruch Hu. 18,000 tzaddikim, that's in Aramaic. Tamneser alfei tzaddikim, 18,000 tzaddikim stand before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the blessed Holy One, before Hashem. It's an interesting number, 18,000. Without going into the details of this number, because it's not really negated to our Havana and Tanya, but what you do see is that it's a multitude, it's a large number. So we see that there are many thousands and thousands of levels, and Alter Rebbe's Taichim, we say 18,000, you could say it's 18,000 individuals. But it's clear that Alter Rebbe's Taichim 18,000 levels. Okay. So that explains in this chapter on Tzaddikim, in Perek Yud, the different levels of Tzaddikim. But specifically with the Tzaddik she'ein negomer. Because there you have a formula which creates variations. The formula we just described. Depending, like he said, Miut hara nishar me'echad abrabosei haroim ubinyim bitule b'miute, and how much it's nullified. What about the Tzaddik Gomer? Continues the Alter Rebbe now and says, by Tzaddik Gomer, you don't have all these levels. Because by Tzaddik Gomer, Mamonashach, since he's transformed completely, so what are you measuring? It's a total transformation. If it's not totally transformed, then he's not a Tzaddik Gomer. If the negative been transformed, all the 1,000 people in the city, or 10,000 people, whatever the number is, have become allies, so where would there be levels? You could hypothetically argue, how much are they allies? But at the end of the day, the Tzaddik Gomer has transformed everything, that there's completely no room for any, not only no opposition, everything has become an asset, an ally to Kedusha and to Elokus. So says the Alter Rebbe, saying Nachanami. Now we're coming into an area that's a rarity of rarity. It's not tens of thousands, it's not 18,000, it's not all the different levels we spoke, tens of thousands. And interesting, the Revavis that he said is 10,000, the Revavis is tens of thousands, the Gemara says 18,000. So just interesting the numbers as they play themselves out here. So he says, now, however, Amayla Tzaddik Gomer, but the level or quality or virtue of the complete tzaddik, Husha Amar Rashbi, about this level is what Rab Shimon Bar Yochai said. Amar Rashbi, he made the famous statement, Re'isi b'nei aliyah v'hem mu'atim. I have seen elevated men. B'nei aliyah means elevated men. We'll soon explain two meanings what that means. But in simple terms, it means someone who's exalted, who's elevated beyond the norm. And they're few. So based on what we're learning here, the few here, not only there's a few of them, individuals, that it's not many. It's not like the Tzaddik Shenagam, we have tens of thousands and many, many levels. There's few levels. In addition to the simple meaning that there's very rare, they're very few. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to continue to explain why they're called Bnei Aliyah. But before we go there, let's elaborate a bit. What's the Alter Rebbe coming to say here? Remember, the theme of the Perek is following the first 9 chapters, where we're talking about the two forces within us, the divine soul and the animal soul. And then in chapter 9, how they come and they are pitted against each other in battle. And who's the tzaddik, like he said at the beginning of this Perek? He started the Perek, where he said, when a person overpowers and wages war with the animal soul, to the point that he eliminates it, and then speaks about the 2 levels. So now he's rounding it out and really explaining what these 2 levels are. So now we're going back to the Tzaddik Gomer. We'd explained that Tzaddik Shein Gomer is distinguished by the different levels that are possible. But here we're talking about the rare, the Bnei Aliyah Shehem Mu'atim, V'hem Mu'atim. To explain to us the uniqueness of this type of individual that transforms the entire body and the citizens, the Irktana and its citizens, completely to Elokus, to Ruchnis, to Kedusha. So now he's going to explain Mu'atim, there are very few, and explain in different language what we learned till now. Remember, their uniqueness is not just that they win over the negative, but they transform the negative. So he says now he's going to teach 2 meanings of Bnei Aliyah, which you can say correspond to the 2 terms, Tzaddik Gomer and Tzaddik V'Tevleh. So the first thing he speaks about, in other words, one is about V'Tevleh, the transformation of the negative to the positive, and Tzaddik Gomer is referring to the Ava, complete love, to godliness, which is the driving force that causes him to completely reject the opposite. So you're going to teach now Bnei Aliyah in 2 ways that correspond to that. And here's what he says. This Gemara, by the way, that he says, B'nei Risi B'nei Alev V'hem Mu'atim, is actually the same Gemara in Sukkah that talks about the 18,000 tzaddikim. So you see right away the contrast. The Sukkah talks about the 18,000, that's a tzaddik she'eino gomer Rashbi. And that's why the Alter Rebbe says the Lashon. Achamayel tzaddik gomer she'omer Rashbi. In other words, after we know about the 18,000, that's discussed on that page, then what is Rashbi talking about? Not the 18,000. He's talking about the Bnei Aliyah she'em mu'atim, the Hem Mu'atim. Shalachei nekrayim b'nei aliyah, says the Alter Rebbe. The first reason is what? And that's why they're called the elevated ones. Shemahapchin hara u'mayla meisei l'kedusha. What's the word aliyah come from? Elevating. Not just that they're higher level. It's also the process of aliyah, being maila. Because they transform the evil urge of the animal soul and elevate it to holiness. Shemahapchim, they transform and elevate it to holiness. Which is interesting. You can transform and it's your ally, but elevating it to holiness means it's absorbed in the initial holiness where there isn't any more two forces here at work. The negative has been transformed and elevated into the positive. K'de'isa b'zeir b'agdoma Kesherotze Rebbe Chia. So in the introduction to Zayar, which is Aleph, which Zayar is right in the Hagdom, in the introduction to Zayar, Dalet Aleph, page 4a. So he says like this: Kesherotze Reb Chia lalis lehecha Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Reb Chia wanted to ascend, and he lalis, to ascend to the heavenly chamber of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Shama kolo de nofik v'omer man minchen di cheshuche mahapchen lenehera v'to'omin merira lemiska ad lo yaisen hacha v'chulu. He heard a voice. Rabbi Chia heard a voice when he was about to enter the chamber of Rashbi. A voice break out and say, "Who among you has transformed darkness into light and bitter flavors into sweet ones before arriving here?" So in other words, in this Heichel of Rashbi, you need to have this aliyah. The aliyah of transforming the dark to the light and the bitter to the sweet. Since Reb Shimon is one of these people, Bnei Aliyah, as he himself testified in Sukkah, so to enter his abode, his domain, you need to have that transformation, and that's why it's called aliyah. And that's the first reason of Bnei Aliyah, which corresponds to the tzaddik v'tevle, that all the negative has become tev, transformed. And we'll stop here and continue next week. TanyaApplied.com, you can find this and all the previous programs, and also ask a question if you like. And everyone have a good tavoch, good week, and be well.
This has been My Life Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.